Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we're going to begin a discussion about America's growing influence in the world and their turn at imperialism. Learning targets today are going to talk about America's factors and the causes of imperialism that made America go overseas and take a greater interest in the world. We'll talk about the first steps toward the position of a world power, and we'll evaluate the acquisition of Hawaii by the United States specifically. So imperialism, if we had to define it, it's one country's control over another country, usually a weaker territory. And there's three major reasons for imperialism. Number one is national superiority. We're just better. Imperial nations use racial superiority, national superiority, and cultural superiority, religious superiority, to justify imperialism. Number two is economic. If raw materials are extracted from the colony and sent back home, it becomes what's called an extractive economy because we're extracting raw materials, we're just using them for their materials. The U.S. has plenty of raw materials. We don't really need any raw materials. Our influence economically outside of the United States is we want more markets to sell our things. So we're trying to find overseas markets in Asia and Latin America. And then the third reason is military in nature, because we need naval bases and places to put naval bases around the world to protect our global trade network. So here is a quick study chart of the causes of imperialism. Imperialist nations, they need a navy, and they need a strong military. So the U.S. decides to increase its military strength, and one of the influencers behind that is a guy by the name of Alfred T. Mahan, and he is a Navy officer who then pushes, and he's a military historian. He looks at all the great countries throughout history and says that they owe their greatness to powerful navies. And he may be a little bit biased, but it's probably still true. Since ancient times, all of the great nations and city-states have had great navies. So the U.S. decides to expand its navies, and they begin producing new steel-plated battleships like the USS Maine, which will come to play next next lesson. And by 1900, the U.S. now has the world's third largest navy because we've built it up in order to protect our overseas trade routes. National superiority. People use social Darwinism as a reason to imperialize others. Life is a competitive struggle. And some races and nations are meant to succeed over others. So imperialist people, if they remain isolated while the European nations conquer the rest of the world, we're not going to survive. Also, if you remember the idea of manifest destiny, where God grants Americans the right to settle the frontier and we should become a nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific, well, that frontier's gone now. And so Josiah Strong is a religious missionary who writes a best-selling book that argues that we need to spread our Western values and keep going across the nation and across the world. And we need to gain converts to Christianity outside of our borders. So a lot of this imperialism is religious in nature as well, because Christianity is superior to all the other religions in these people's beliefs. And a writer by the name of Frederick J. Turner also feels that America has always had a large amount of land to settle. But now that we've settled all of our large amounts of land, we need to go ahead and expand into foreign lands and have a place where ambitious Americans can go to pursue their fortunes and gain a fresh start. The imperialist tendencies begin, you can trace it to 1853, where Commodore Matthew Perry leads a large naval force into Tokyo Bay, Japan. And traditionally, Japan has denied access to its ports from other countries. They're kind of a closed-off nation. These Japanese people have never even seen steamships before, and when they pull into Tokyo Bay, they think they're giant dragons puffing smoke. And so they the Matthew Perry goes ahead and gets Japan to realize how far behind the times they are by showering the Japanese emperor with lavish Western gifts, and they decide that they are behind militarily as well. So Japan decides to open its ports with other nations, specifically the United States. Another imperialist point in history can be traced to 1867, where William Seward, our Secretary of State, buys Alaska from the country of Russia for $7.2 million, or just a couple of cents per acre, since Alaska is now our largest state. It's known as Seward's folly, or like Seward's dumb mistake by journalists, but it's an important purchase now, and we can trace it back to history as one of the important steps towards imperialism, because it gives us access to the Pacific coming from the north. It's also rich in timber, oil, and other natural resources that can be sold. And in the mid-1880s, gold is discovered there, and it triggers the Klondike Gold Rush. But people realize that the harsh winters, the difficult terrain, the lack of transportation, it's all too much, and it ends the rush by 1899. That is our expansion into the Pacific. Now look at our expansion into Latin America. In 1889, we called together a meeting of 17 Latin American countries and the United States, and we realize and we tout the benefits of economic cooperation among all these nations. So this leads to the Pan-American Highway system, which connects the U.S. to the Central and South America for trade. And in 1895, we kind of get some saber rattling again with Great Britain, because they have a colony in the Western Hemisphere called British New Guinea and Venezuela, and there is a border dispute between the two. And President Grover Cleveland claims that Britain is violating our Monroe Doctrine, and if you remember that, it means that Europe needs to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and threatens U.S. intervention in this border dispute. And Britain, after some international saber rattling, decides to accept a growing U.S. sphere of influence in Latin America. So now let's take a look at our situation in Hawaii, which has been economically linked to the United States since the late 1700s, because it's halfway between the United States and East Asia, and ships stop here to refuel, amongst other things. And there's two major problems with the Hawaii and what's going on there. Basically, in the late 1800s, a new tariff on sugar has been passed, sugar from Hawaii. And so this makes it more expensive than sugar produced in the U.S. So the white planters here that moved to Hawaii to harvest sugar are saying, oh no, nobody's going to buy our sugar now because it's more expensive. And so they have power in Hawaii, a little bit more than the queen would like, and her name is Queen Laliuokalani, and she resents the power of these white planters. So in 1893, after a struggle, the American planters overthrow the queen, and the U.S. Marines actually helped the rebels seize power, and a new government is developed in Hawaii, led by Sanford B. Dole. And if Dole sounds familiar, it's because his brother actually comes to Hawaii after this and begins or expands the Dole Fruit Company, which has had power and influence in Hawaii for a long time. So this new government asked to be annexed by the United States, which means they want to become a state or a territory. And here's a picture of all of the Western Pacific and Southern Pacific expansion that the United States has done. And President Benjamin Harrison signs the annexation treaty, but they can't get Senate approval before Grover Cleveland becomes president again. And after an investigation, Cleveland refuses to sign the treaty because he finds that the Hawaiian people don't want to be annexed. He finds that the Americans in Hawaii played he says the Hawaiian people were wronged for the conduct of Americans in Hawaii, and he apologizes for that. But the West Coast still really wants to annex Hawaii because California businesses have strong ties with these Hawaiian planters, and so after Cleveland gets out of office. And in 1896, McKinley versus William Jennings Bryan. When McKinley enters office in 1897, and then during the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. annexes Hawaii finally in 1898. So that is all the learning targets I have for you today. Make sure to fill them out. Bring any questions about imperialism back to class, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.